First, I thought I should tell you a little bit about how I got interested in religion, because I was never trained to study religion, unlike many of you who were trained to be experts on religion. In my case, it was a combination of life circumstance and some interesting good fortune in terms of my training. So I grew up in Beirut in Lebanon, and I survived the religious wars in the 70s and the 80s. So from where I come from, you have to be in a coma not to notice religion, that there's a religion in the world. So imagine my surprise. I moved to North America. I went to graduate school. I did my PhD at the University of Michigan. And I remember flipping through handbooks of psychology or textbooks looking for the word religion. See, I thought, well, surely we know a lot about religion, given how important it is, and there's not a single thing. It's not even in the index. The word religion did not appear, or still, in fact, in the majority of textbooks or handbooks, you don't see religion. I would talk to my professors, and they had this vague idea that, yeah, I guess there is some people are religious, but of course it's but of course it's not. I mean, it's just on its way out, right? It's not gonna. I mean, there are some people out there, but it's not gonna last. So that was surprising to me. And then I had the good fortune of meeting Scott Atran, the anthropologist who at the time, this was in around 2000, who was getting interested in the question of the evolutionary origins of religion. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to see if we can, learn a little bit more about this topic. And that's how I got started. And then when I was an untenured professor, of course, I would never advertise to people that I was interested in religion. That would have been career suicide. So I was doing it in secret for a while. But it has been a remarkable, dramatic change in my field of psychology on this. So now there's a lot of interest in religion, and psychology journals are now routinely publishing research on religion and the psychology of religion. This is really quite dramatic turnaround. So I think it's an exciting time right now to study this topic. And like Ted was saying yesterday, religion is one of these topics that also naturally brings people from different disciplines together, because you can't study religion from a single perspective. I think it's one of these things that's just too complex, and you need different converging perspectives: historical, psychological, sociological, anthropological, neuroscience, to get a handle on the complexity of the beast. So that's. I just want to share this with you because I thought many of us have very different ways of coming into this topic, and that's my story. Okay, so we know that that there are some recurring building blocks that seem to predispose minds to religion, and I'll say a little bit more about that. Ted talked about that a little bit already. But one of the things that really interests us, in addition to that, to these building blocks of religion that seem to be possibly built into the human brain, we also know that religions culturally evolve dramatically over historical time. I mean, religions mutate, they change, they evolve, they stabilize. So it's a perfect topic to study if you're interested in cultural evolution, if you're interested in understanding how beliefs, behaviors, practices change or stabilize over historical time. And a lot of religion is like that. There are estimated 10,000 religions in the world. And one really interesting fact about religions is that even though there's enormous cultural diversity of religious beliefs and practices, there's an interesting statistical pattern. These beliefs and practices are not randomly distributed. They're actually very systematically distributed. Just a few handful of religious traditions account for the vast majority of believers in the world. Put another way, some religious traditions are incredibly successful in the cultural marketplace. Others are not so much. And I think this has been a question that hasn't been well addressed so far in the cognitive science of religion or in the evolutionary study of religion. And this is one of the key questions we have that we'd like to try to answer part of this large project. So I think here's a basic story that also Ted talked about, and I'll just elaborate a little bit. So one way to think about this is that we have basic cognitive biases that predispose our minds to have religious-like intuitions. So religion, in some ways, comes for free. So theory of mind, teleological intuitions, possibly anthropomorphizing, which we can often do promiscuously, can lead us to have religious-like intuitions. But that, of course, doesn't give you religion, full-blown religion that we see in the world, because these are templates And these templates get filled by with cultural learning and cultural transmission, and then you get basically a wide variety of a range of cultural beliefs that these templates are producing. And then once you have these cultural variants that are available, then you have basically cultural selection and ongoing cultural selection. We think that some cultural variants of these beliefs are more successful than others in the marketplace of cultural representations. So for example, if a certain religious belief has effects on cooperation, then groups that have these beliefs, happen to have these beliefs, are going to have an easier time cooperating. As a result, these beliefs will spread because cooperating groups do better than non-cooperating groups. So this is the basic idea that we're working with, and it's spelled out in more detail in a book that I recently wrote that's coming out in September. Another motivation one of the motivations that I had to write this book was that I was, when I started working on religion, the perspective that I worked with Scott Atran and others was the cognitive byproduct perspective. But then over time, gradually, I started to become really impressed with a lot of evidence that even though I still think that the cognitive byproduct perspective is an essential part of the story, but it's also clear that once you have religious-like intuitions and that produce religious beliefs, these beliefs have effects, have social effects on people's lives. So in particular, for example, effects on prosocial behavior. And once that's the case, then the story to some extent gets more complicated. So this is a combination of byproduct and cultural evolution story, and in my mind, synthesizes the best strengths of the cognitive byproduct approach and the adaptationist program in religion. So we can talk more about that later if you like. So here's an example of an incredibly successful religion, right? So like, what are some examples? The Mormon, the Church of the Latter-day Saints. It was founded about 170 years ago. Here's a graph that shows the growth of the Mormon Church by number of members, that's the blue line, by number of missions around the world, that's the yellow line, a number of missionaries that are sent around the world, that's red, and number of countries where there are Mormon churches. No matter how you look at it, a dramatic, incredible growth, right? The estimate is about 40% per decade. That's really dramatic. If you're investing in stocks, if this was a stock, corporation, you would make billions if you invested in this church. Now contrast this, for example, with to give you one example, the Oneida Perfectionists, which was another commune that was founded around the same time in upstate New York that lasted about 30 years, and then they disbanded, and they founded the silverware company. So you might have silverware called Oneida. That's it. That's the end of that story, right? So one of the interesting questions that really interests me is what happened? Why is it that these guys did so well and the other guys not so well? Okay. So what are some of the features? What are the cultural features of certain religious groups that make them more likely to spread demographically as well as in other ways? So I think that one of the ideas we're working with is that we think that there are some converging elements of a prosocial religious package that can galvanize cooperation and commitment in a group, which makes these groups more successful and make them outcompete other groups. It's still an open question what these elements are, but I think here are some candidates that we're working with. One is it's probably a good idea to have a big moralizing God that knows a lot, who monitors 24/7, and intervenes and cares about what people do, intervenes, punishes transgressors, cheaters, norm violators. That probably helps for groups, especially when groups become large and there's anonymity invades interactions, and then you need basically some kind of mechanism to make people be nice to each other, even though they don't have other incentives to be nice to each other necessarily. Extravagant displays, that we see a lot of these kinds of extravagant displays that seem to be important in many successful religions. And by that I mean also rituals, costly signals, creds, we'll talk about that in a minute. Synchrony, there's some evidence and growing evidence that synchronous rituals seem to make people more prosocial and more cooperative. So it's no surprise that prosocial religions stumble on the idea of let's have more synchronous rituals, song and dance, right? That makes people more cooperative. There's some evidence that successful religions also inculcate self-control. So the better people can practice restraining their selfish urges, for example, restraining their own self-interest to the benefit of the group, the more likely you have group beneficial norms spreading. And there already is some psychological evidence that at least some kinds of religious beliefs and practices makes people better at self-control. Moral realism, the idea that the norms in our group are not just arbitrary conventions, but that they're built into the structure of the world. That's how things are, and we can't change them. Makes it more compelling. So it's an interesting testable idea. There are other things that are also very important and I think not very well studied yet. So for example, not surprisingly, prosocial religions have very high fertility rates, like the Latter-day Saints Church. And by any measure you look at, prosocial religions are basically outbreeding secular groups, right? So that's another very important. If there are packages of beliefs and practices that make people have more children, however that's done, whatever the mechanism is, these groups are going to expand and at the expense of other groups. Proselytizing can help. It doesn't have to be. It's not necessary, but if you can convert people, that helps too. Notice that this is a package. None of these features are essential, and it's a gradation. You can have more of this or less of this that could have effects on the cultural success of these traditions. Another way to look at this that I think also interests us, many of us here, is the problem of large-scale cooperation. Right? How is it that for a vast majority of our of human history, human ancestors lived in very tight-knit, small societies of foragers. Then all of a sudden, around 10 to 15,000 years ago, there was a scaling up, which has gotten us to vast metropolises, as Ted said yesterday. So how do we get people to cooperate in these completely anonymous interactions where genetic relatedness basically collapses very, very quickly, and reciprocity doesn't work very well when you have larger groups, right? So we need additional mechanisms, cultural and other mechanisms to get people to cooperate with each other. We think religion is one of them. It's not necessarily the only thing, but this kind of prosocial religion could be one of these solutions to the problem of large-scale cooperation. And we think that part of this package, one of the key things is, of course, watchful gods, again, who are interventionist, powerful, and willing to monitor. So the problem is big groups, and the possible solution is basically an eye in the sky that's watching over you, so you can behave yourself. So here you have Buddha eyes from Nepal, right? Buddha is watching you. If you don't believe Buddhism is a religion, go to Nepal or Tibet. It's all over the landscape. From ancient Egyptian religion, Eye of Horus. Of course, the Abrahamic God is very well known to be a very watchful God, although we don't have a lot of pictures of him. Another interesting link to historical evidence and archaeological work is, of course, this whole debate about whether or not how the religion came to be. We're talking about big religion, right, with rituals and priesthood classes, etc. So one standard story in archaeology is that first you get agriculture somehow. It's unclear how you do it, but you get agriculture, and then as a consequence of settled agriculture, you get bigger towns, more population density, and then you got religion. That's one theory. But there's another possibility, which I think is now being considered in more seriousness, which is that maybe it's the other way around. Maybe first came the temple, as Klaus Schmidt said, and then the city, right? So it could be that religion was a galvanizing force for settled life as opposed to the other way around. It could also be both, right? It could be a circular process. So in our project, one of the key things that we'd like to do is to understand how people mentally represent God's mind. And then, so that's one of our key questions. So we want to know, for example, in a given cultural group or practice or tradition, how much people think God knows, right? That God, if you're doing something in secret and nobody sees, would the spirits or God or the particular local deity in that tradition know what this person did? gleaning from the ethnographic record, it appears that there's a lot of cultural variability on this. And gods come in all kinds of shapes and forms and different degrees of omniscience. So we want to measure that. And we think that that might have something to do with how prosocial people are willing to be, given how much they are thinking about these gods or spirits, how much these gods care about moral issues that or social norms in a group, right? And again, there appears to be cultural variability in the ethnographic record, how much gods care. Some gods are morally indifferent. People think, yeah, we have gods, they have spirits, but they don't care what we're doing. That's one extreme. And then there are different degrees of how much the gods care, to the very extreme, which is like, a perfect example is the Abrahamic God, who cares deeply about what people are doing. And when people violate social norms, cultural norms, God is willing to intervene and punish. So supernatural punishment, again, another important element. So we like to measure these dimensions. There could be others that could be very important. So another one might be, for example, how much people think God is a person-like agent as opposed to an abstract, impersonal God. And we already have some preliminary evidence. So Rita McNamara, who's here, she has some preliminary evidence that the more people think God has a mind and is a person-like agent, the more they think God is willing to punish. So it becomes crucial in terms of our understanding of how religion can be forced for cooperation, to understand how much people think God has a mind. The second key question that we'd like to address in this project is link our understanding of how people mentally represent and understand their supernatural agents with prosocial behavior. So is it the case that some of these cultural variants of supernatural beliefs are more likely to produce prosocial behavior than others? So you're following my reasoning, I hope, here. The more omniscience, the more moral concern, the more mind, the more punishment, willingness to punish, you would expect more prosociality in these societies. So what we're proposing to do, and Ben will talk about the study itself in more detail shortly, is to combine the strengths of two different ways of looking at this question in terms of experimental and ethnographic approaches. We'd like to do some religious priming in different cultural contexts where we can bring to mind religious beliefs, supernatural beliefs in people's minds, and then give people the opportunity to play basically an economic game where they can decide to be prosocial or not with a stranger. And we want to see, given the particular mental representation of gods in that particular culture, are people going to be more prosocial when they think about their gods? Let me quickly give you a very brief overview of some of the lines of evidence that already exist that have led us to this hypothesis. So one very interesting study, there are several of these studies, but I'm going to highlight one of them, takes advantage of the standard cross-cultural sample of the ethnographic record, 186 cultures, and then this is a study by Rose and Raymond, where they looked at the extent to which people in a particular group endorse basically a big, powerful, moralizing God. Okay, that was one variable. And the other variable they quoted was how big these groups are. And groups in the ethnographic record vary on complexity and size, right? So at one extreme are communities that have no political organization, like the Hadza. At the other extreme are, of course, the modern societies with millions of people living together in large states. And then you have a full range in between, like chiefdoms or intermediate. So if there's anything to the idea that religion might have played a role in the scaling up of human societies, then you would expect that as societies scale up, they would rely more on these moralizing gods to enforce cooperation, because you can't get big if you're a group without some degree of tightly enforcing cooperation among strangers. So you have to expect a correlation between group size and moralizing gods. And that's what you find. Among the community level, the prevalence of moralizing gods are rare, right? Small foraging societies typically don't have big moralizing gods. That's at the very left here. But as you get to states and large states, like the societies we live in, the vast majority of humanity lives in here, by the way, right? So That's another interesting puzzle, right? How did we get from there to here? That's another thing that we're trying to address here. So then you get, basically overwhelmingly, you find that if they have a God, it's a moralizing God. It's an interventionist God who cares about people, who knows everything, etc. So this gives us some hint that something is going on here, but it doesn't tell us that this is happening because these beliefs have effects on cooperation, right? And it's a correlational data, so it could be other interpretations. The authors of the study, they try to control for other alternative explanations, like inequality, whether or not these societies are missionized, population density, what region they come from. You still get the effect, but nevertheless, there could always be some other alternative explanation. So another advance, I think, another interesting progress on this question was a study that Joe Henrich led a few years ago, where he had 15 cultures of horticulturalists and pastoralists in different parts of the world, where he had the participants in these cultures play economic games. And one of the key variables that he looked at was whether or not people subscribe to a world religion. And in this case, it meant either Christianity or Islam, right? So do you adhere to a local religion, typically not having moralizing gods, or do you adhere to a world religion with a big, powerful God? And what he found was, among other things, he and his colleagues found that that variable, if people said, yeah, I believe in the Christian God, or I'm a Christian or I'm a Muslim, predicted much more prosocial behavior towards strangers in 2 different games. Actually, people are basically transferring more money to a random stranger of their own local commune, local area, if they say they're Christian or Muslim. So that's interesting. That now that links the religion up with cooperation levels or prosocial levels. So that's an important piece of the puzzle. However, the issue with this study is that, again, we don't have random assignments, so it's a correlational finding, right? So it could be that there's some, maybe it's not that religion, prosocial religion, is causing more cooperation. Maybe people who are prosocial to begin with end up becoming, adopting these religions. Could be one possibility. It could be a third variable possibility. So to address that issue, my colleagues and I have done some priming experiments where we can actually randomly assign people to think about their religious beliefs or to think about something else. So this is the study you see here is by Azim Sharif and myself. That was done a few years ago, where we brought people here. This was a sample in Vancouver, where we brought people into our lab, and then we had them play the dictator game, where they're given a certain amount of money, like $10, and then they are told there's another person in the other room, and it's your decision. You can share this $10 we're giving you for your participation. You can share any of this amount or nothing at all with the other stranger. How much would you like to give? Okay? So this is a dictator game. But before they played this game, we had them play a word game, what they thought was a word game, where we planted words related to religion in the word game, like God, divine, spirit, etc. Or the neutral words. That's the neutral condition. And in a third condition, we had them play with words that had to do with secular institutions that also enforce morality, like police, judge, court, contract. And you see in the results here, religious prime, thinking about religion boosted giving to the stranger compared to a neutral prime. So in a neutral prime, people gave a little bit over $2 on average. In the religious prime, people gave over $4 on average. And in the secular prime, also people gave more. So it's also, again, it's important to realize that religion is not the only way you can get cooperation levels going. You can get them through secular institutions, which is another thing that we're interested in. Although these are, secular institutions are relatively recent, and they're relatively rare in the world, right? Most societies are still struggling with secular institutions. If you look at people's disposition to say, I'm a religious person or I believe in God, does that predict giving? It doesn't. On the left side, you look at how much people say they believe in God. There's a bit of a tendency in the right direction, but it's not reliable. And this is a typical finding where we find that, at least in Western samples, weird samples, how much people say I believe in God doesn't predict anything necessarily, or the direction is in the right direction but not significant. But reminding people of their beliefs makes a big difference. Okay, so taking all these things together, we have some. So this is evidence that with random assignment we can get effects on cooperation. But the limitation of these studies is that we only have this evidence in one culture, right? One culture context. So we don't know, for example, if we did this study in a place where the people believe in a different God, would we get the same effect? If the God is not as moralizing, or in a different culture, people don't think that God knows as much, would we get the same effect? So we don't know. I think that's the limitation of this study. But in combination, in these different lines of work, lead us to the hypothesis that maybe it's a reasonable idea to test that as gods become more omniscient, more powerful, more interventionist, reminders of these gods have effects on cooperation, which then leads to these groups expanding at the expense of others. This is another slide where we show that the religious prime doesn't simply nudge people a little bit in more pro-social direction. It changes people's understanding of what the right norm is. So when people are playing in the neutral prime, the typical behavior is to give nothing. Okay, the model response is just take the money and go home. Whereas in religious prime, people become more fair. The typical response, the majority response, is to share half and half. So I think that this is important because it shows that religion seems to be associated with particular kinds of norms that can be enforced in a group. These days, the priming literature is under attack. There are some concerns about whether or not priming effects work. So, and it's a legitimate question, of course. We always have to ask ourselves how reliable these effects are. So you might be wondering about that. So recently, Azim Sharif and Ayana Willard, who are here in the audience, ran a meta-analysis. So we collected all the studies that we could find that have used religious priming with random assignment. Most of them are published, some of them are unpublished. And then we looked to see, is there an average effect across all these studies? And the other thing that was interesting to us is that if we split our sample by people who are religious, who say they're religious, compared to people who say, I'm not religious, I don't have religion, would that make a difference? I apologize, this is a very small font, so you probably can't see very well. But you can, on the left side is the samples, all the studies with the samples of religious people, and on average you can see an effect, right? That's actually a pretty sizable effect. It's about 0.4, I think. 0.3, is it? 0.37, excuse me. 0.37, which is a sizable effect in psychology. I think the average effect is 0.2 in psychology. So this is bigger than the average effect. But if you look at people who are not religious, you don't get an effect. It's all over the place. Some studies find an effect. Some of our own studies have found an effect, but others haven't. On average, you get 0.04? 0.1? 0.1? Okay, so it's not significant. Sorry?
I think for that, because this is the pro-social one.
Yeah, this is only pro-social outcomes. 0.09, thanks, Anne. So these are only studies that have done religious priming, and the outcome measure is some pro-social behavior. We have another meta-analysis where we look at all kinds of other outcomes, like self-control and etc. But looking at only pro-social behavior, we have a reliable effect for people who are religious, but people who say, I'm not religious, they don't seem to be primable. This is important and interesting for theories of atheism, for example. Like, are atheists implicitly religious? You would expect if they were, they should show priming effects, because they're not aware that they're being primed with religious words. But that's another story we can get to later. Okay, so I want to start to finish up. A couple of things that also we have some evidence that also is interesting to think about as we design our studies. One line of work that Azim has been doing, looking at not so much how much people think about God, but how people mentally represent God as a punishing agent or a forgiving agent, right? That's another key variable. And this actually came as a surprise to me. I didn't think this was be the case, but now there's quite a bit of evidence that the pro-social effects of religion are mainly having to do with God as a punisher. And if anything, if people think God is forgiving, they cheat more. So in this study that Azim did, we measured how much people thought God is forgiving versus punishing. then we had them. We gave them the opportunity to cheat on a test, and in anonymity, so nobody was there, but the computer recorded the cheating acts. And what we find is that people cheat less when they think God is punishing, but people cheat more when they think God is forgiving. In another study that Azim did with another colleague, they looked at the prevalence of belief in hell versus heaven across cultures. And then they looked at crime rates and other kinds of, I think they had murder and rape and a variety of other things. And what they found was controlling for a number of things, in places where there is stronger belief in hell versus heaven, there is less crime. And vice versa. Places where there's more belief in heaven and hell, there's more crime. So it might be that these effects are really, that supernatural punishment in particular is a key element of getting pro-social religions off the ground. You can't do it by just having a nice God who forgives everything. That might be a reassuring idea, but it's not going to make people to cooperate. A couple of other things that are important. I think it's part of the story, although we haven't so far been able to. I think it's going to take a little bit more time to get these ideas and measure these ideas in the field, but I think we should do it at some point. One is the idea that it's not enough to believe in God or think about God as people are interacting with each other. You also need, belief has to be credible, right? So Joe Henry has a paper where he talks about credibility enhancing displays. These are acts, extravagant acts, that often are found in religions where people are doing extravagant things, and when we watch those people, they're doing extravagant things, we can infer that they must really believe the underlying belief must be true. Otherwise, why would they do this, right? So things like the Taipusam ritual, right, where people are skewering themselves, right? If you really weren't committed to the Hindu god of this festival, you wouldn't do this, right? So this makes me more confident that this guy is really a believer, and I'm more likely to. So the model that Joe argues is that this is a cultural transmission model. So if I see this guy do this, I'm more likely to acquire this belief, which leads to a cultural transmission, to an epidemic of the belief spreading. There are other ideas out there as well, actually older ideas about costly signaling that Rich Sosis and Joseph Bulbuya have been writing about, where it says that these are costly signals. Where I see people do this, I'm more likely to cooperate with them. So these are two alternative mechanisms. They can both be true. It might be both going on. Something that we haven't fleshed out in detail yet, but these are good ideas to work with to understand how belief becomes credible and how these rituals and behaviors can galvanize commitment. The final piece I think is important to appreciate is intergroup competition. So, and again, this is not something that we're working on yet, but I think at some point it's going to be an important piece of the puzzle, that these religious groups and religious traditions and ideas are basically in culture competition. So we need to account for that. And it's a good example of this is a lovely study by Rich Sosis, where he compared the cultural success or survival rates of communes in 19th century America. So in one study, comparing religious communes to secular communes, you get a massive effect. Religious communes survive longer than secular communes. In a subsequent study, he also showed that this effect is mainly driven by the fact that the religious communes have a lot of basically, they're stricter. They have lots of restrictions on behavior. And once you account for these restrictions, you can account for this difference. Secular communes don't make people restrict themselves as much as religious communes do. So again, going back to the previous slide, these restrictions, these extravagant behaviors might be playing an important role in cooperation levels and leading to more competition, more successful competition. Okay. I just want to end with a couple of open questions that I think we're still debating, and we'd love to hear comments. And then when Ben goes into more detail about the studies, that you'll see more clearly why these are issues. So one important question that we need to resolve is we don't know exactly how far religious prosociality extends. So if you are a committed Christian and you meet a other Christian, you're supposed to be prosocial with that other person. That's pretty clear. But what if you meet a stranger who is not Christian? Are you also more likely to be prosocial with that person? And we can argue both ways, right? So on one hand, prosocial religions might want to be more prosocial with strangers because that could be also an opportunity for proselytizing. But at the same time, if you're indiscriminately prosocial, that's not going to help the stability of the group. So there might be an interesting, tricky variable here. And we'd like to measure this in our studies to understand where the boundaries are. We want to know more about the role of secular institutions and to what extent secular institutions replace religion. And there's some interesting sociological evidence that's been happening in Europe, for example, Northern Europe and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, where the more the state provides services that religions used to provide, the less people become religious. So, but I wonder if we can test this more with the cross-cultural samples we have. There are some issues about how to take priming techniques into the field with populations that are not necessarily literate and are used to the kinds of gadgets we have here, like computers and etc. So there are some methodological challenges with using priming as a technique across cultures. And finally, another point to think about is explicit as opposed to implicit mental representation of God. So the most straightforward thing we can do to go to these cultures, ranging in different social complexity levels, different traditions, is to ask people, if you think about your local God, what do you, tell you more about what you think about this God. But we know as psychologists that often what people have implicit understandings that may not necessarily necessarily be able to articulate to researchers, and this might be important. So how can we get at those? Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you. So we thought that it's easiest if Ben goes next, and then you can see the whole package, and then we can open up for questions.